Senate Democrats are slamming the Trump administration for excluding them from a briefing this week on the string of deadly strikes against boats allegedly carrying drugs in the Caribbean and Pacific. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, who's the top Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, said the bipartisan briefing was, in his words, indefensible, dangerous, and a new low.
If you're sitting in this room getting clearly what had been prior Gang of Eight level classified information, didn't somebody raise their hand and say, well, holy crap, where are the Democrats? Who was willing to say, isn't there a constitutional obligation here? It is about separation of powers. For the folks who wave their Constitution around, read the damn thing and then explain why you would sit through that briefing and not call foul.
It seems like you reached out to the Trump administration yesterday when this news broke. Did they give you the documents as a member of the Gang of Eight?
I've not gotten out. They're supposedly going to make them available now.
You've not received an explanation why Democrats were excluded from the briefing yesterday?
We got a ham-handed, oh, maybe you're right, whatever. I say
Colorful there, but it speaks to the anger that we're hearing from Democrats in both chambers about this, because in the other chamber, Democrats on the House Armed Services Committee were briefed yesterday, but they said they were frustrated by the answers they received and the lack of lawyers present. This all comes as the administration continues to ramp up strikes at sea and openly float the possibility of broadening those attacks to land. The Wall Street Journal reports that the administration has identified targets in Venezuela that include military facilities used to smuggle drugs, citing U.S. officials familiar with the matter. The paper goes on to report that a potential air campaign would focus on targets that sit at the nexus of the drug gangs and the regime of Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro. I want to bring in retired CIA officer Mark Polymeropoulos. He's an MSNBC national security and intelligence analyst. And you've also been so clear-eyed in talking to us about these strikes from the very beginning, about the ethical, moral, and legal dilemmas innate within them and the lack of transparency from the administration. So when we hear House Armed Services Committee members yesterday saying, yeah, people briefed us, but it was folks on the policy and political side, not lawyers, what does that tell you, and why are they so concerned about the legal aspects of this? Because you've been great on this aspect.
So, Ali, Senator Warner is pissed, and you can tell, and he has a right to be. That was pretty unusual how passionate he was, but that's because he's been a member of the Senate Select Committee of Intelligence. He's the vice chairman. He's the ranking Democratic member. And this is an abrogation of kind of the usual norms of what is done. SISI is what we call it, is a committee that usually works on a bipartisan basis, and that's the real check on government power. And the fact that the administration is not sharing this information is really odd, and it goes against all the norms, because congressional oversight is really important when it comes to intelligence world in terms of national security. And as a former CIA officer, I will tell you that we actually welcome this. As a CIA officer, I actually spent a lot of time running covert action programs. We are given a tremendous power by the state. We need that check. We always used to joke when we would kind of go over what we were doing in the global war on terrorism, strikes, for example, in the Middle East. Our congressional staffers and members were with us every step of the way. That is really important. That's not happening. And then it just goes to show, what are they hiding? What are they not telling us about authorities, about the intelligence that's collected? Really norm busting, and Senator Warner is right to complain. Where's Senator Cotton, by the way? The majority chief of the Senate Select Committee. He should be the one saying, no, we can't have a members-only briefing just for Republicans. Everybody has to be there. And
I also think it's important when you talk about Senator Mark Warner and the fury that you saw from him there. He has made the point repeatedly on Capitol Hill that this kind of intelligence briefing is not a partisan thing. There is an assumption that every member of Congress, whether you're a D or an R, should have the information so that you can understand, A, from an oversight perspective, what the administration is doing, but B, from a policymaking perspective, should you have to vote on sanctions or an authorization of military force, you need to understand the dynamics in a classified fashion. The other piece of this for Mark Warner is that he worked for years alongside the now Secretary of State, but previously the ranking member or the lead member on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and that's Marco Rubio.
That's right.
The fact that Rubio now, when he hears Warner saying we need these kinds of briefings, it doesn't fall on deaf ears. You have to imagine.
Rubio knows, by the way.
Yeah.
I've actually briefed briefed both of them. I've testified in front of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence multiple times. I literally with both of those senators. They were really good on this. And again, it's something that shouldn't be happening now. Everybody knows better. And by the way, Ali, what if this happened under a Democratic administration? The Republicans would be going crazy right now. So this has got to be fixed. Will it be? I don't know.
I think that is an open question. I did have Senator Kennedy the other day say to me, well, Marco, he still calls him Marco because, of course, colleagues are forever. But he said Marco briefed us, and I would like him to give the same kind of a briefing to my Democratic colleagues. So it's not that every Republican is sitting around saying this is how it should be. And I think there is some discomfort in bipartisan fashion around how this particular instance went down. I think the other thing that we've been looking at this week, if we shift our focus overseas into the Middle East, is what's going on in this ceasefire in Israel. We read earlier in the show about the return of hostage remains by Hamas, but then we also saw this week bring more strikes from Israel into Gaza. You've just written about this in a piece for a Swedish think tank. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing as still an unanswered question, but then also in this latest back and forth between both sides.
So, Ali, it's precisely what you and I have talked about for weeks now, that the original agreement, the ceasefire for return of hostages, was a good agreement. Tenuous, and we see that right now.
Yeah.
But getting to further stages is going to be really hard. And right now, you actually see the U.S. has actually given Israel the okay to kind of go after Hamas again. It's going to take a lot of diplomatic work to even move things forward. But I think there's a key piece on this, a fundamental. Well, two things. One is this international security force. How in the world are, for example, the Egyptians or the government of Turkey going to send forces to get in gunfights with Hamas? That's not going to happen. Yeah. And so there's a big question on what do you do with Hamas right now, who is still in power. The other piece is kind of a fundamental in that this whole issue, and it's what I wrote about in the paper, is that, the Abraham Accords, which were much celebrated, Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, was integral in this, really never solved the Palestine question. I mean, what to do about the future of the Palestinians. It was in essence, a peace treaty amongst Israel and states, such as the United Arab Emirates, but nothing on the Palestinians. And what happened over the years? Well, obviously, Hamas saw this. They plotted, and then October 7th. And so unless we get to that core fundamental issue, how to kind of deal with Palestinian self-determination, which is hard for the Israelis now after October 7th. But unless we actually deal with that, nothing's going to happen other than what we have right now, which is a ceasefire kind of in limbo, and we kind of muddle through this.
A ceasefire in limbo that the administration continues to maintain is intact. And I keep thinking back to the role that the vice president played in sort of laying expectations out, where he was asked repeatedly, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, when he was in the region, about what would happen in the instance of Hamas violating it or Israel violating it. Both sides at that point were a few days in saying, well, we see violations already. And he basically said, we need flexibility, we need patience. We're not just going to solve this overnight. But the administration clearly showing that they want to allow leniency for things to happen that might otherwise cause people to say, well, the ceasefire is broken. But instead, the administration remaining committed to it. And we'll see what phase 2, if it comes, what it also brings. Retired CIA officer Mark Polymeropoulos, we will have you back repeatedly to talk about it. It's so important. Thank you for coming on.